Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart, where we reminisce about the food that we grew up with and the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives. My very special guest today is legendary country music singer, producer, composer, Kathy Mattea. Hailed by the Washington Post as one of Nashville's finest song interpreters, Kathy Mattea has enjoyed much success and acclaim during her 35-year career in country, bluegrass, and folk music, having won 2 Grammy Awards, 4 CMA Awards, recorded 5 gold albums and 1 platinum album, while having charted 30 singles on the Billboard Hot Country Song charts with 4 #1 country singles. In addition to creating and recording music and performing live on tour, Kathy is involved with public broadcasting, consulting and contributing on screen in Ken Burns' 2019 PBS documentary, Country Music. She also recently replaced founder Larry Gross as the host of the long-running NPR show, Mountain Stage, a wonderful show, by the way, with an extraordinary, eclectic group of musicians who appear. Her newest album is called Pretty Bird. Please join me in welcoming my fellow West Virginia native, Kathy Mattea. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Chris.
So nice to have you here. And as I always do as we start the show, the first thing I ask people is about Providence, where we're from, because so much of that has to do with where we grew up. I mean, obviously where we grew up, but also the food that we were surrounded with. So tell me a little bit about where you were born.
Well, I was born and raised in a small town outside of Charleston, West Virginia, in Kanawha County.
I know it well.
My hometown was called Cross Lanes. It was named for the stoplight. That was our most prominent feature.
I love
We're
it.
very proud of our stoplight. And it was a bedroom community for Charleston, but also right across over the mountain was Nitro, West Virginia, which was part of the Kanawha Valley. And there were chemical plants all up and down that river. And my dad worked at Monsanto for most of his adult life. And my mom grew up in Putnam County, just down the river, the next county west. And my dad grew up in Fayette County, just the next county east. And both of them grew up in coal towns, but both my grandfathers owned their own houses. They didn't grow up in company houses. Which was a source of great pride in my family.
So then tell me a little bit about home, what it was like at home. Your mom was a homemaker, your dad worked?
My mom was a homemaker. My dad worked at a chemical plant. I had 2 older brothers. They were 9 and 13 years older than me. Ooh. I was the surprise kid who came along.
Interesting.
And my poor mother, my mom was like all set to have the boys in school and get her life back. And she gets pregnant with me. And what does she get? Basically a border collie in human form.
Why do you say that?
Because I had so much energy. Now they just give me a big fat dose of Ritalin, and be done with it. But I had a relentless curiosity and energy. And so when I went to school, I skipped the first grade. They plopped me into the second grade after a month.
Had you had any preschool at all?
I'd had kindergarten. That was it.
Right. But then you were ready to go.
Well, what actually happened was my border collie nature.
Yes.
My brothers were in junior high, high school, whatever. They were like, I think when I was a toddler, they were like 16 and 13, 12, 13. And they would go do their homework in the basement. And I wanted homework because I wanted to be like them. So they'd give me math problems to do. And I was so curious. I kept asking what things were. And so I learned to read before I got into school. And so when I was in the first grade, I could read and do math. And they started testing me, and then they just plopped me in the second grade.
This is interesting because, I have grandchildren, and my 2 older grandchildren are 12 and 10. They're boys, and they have a younger sister. And she, interestingly, of the 3, is the fiercest and the one who is most adventurous, the one who is sort of, willing to get out in the world much more readily than the boys are. She has much more self-confidence. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that she had 2 older brothers and had to fight through that testosterone.
Yeah.
When she was
younger.
younger.
You're sort of the family pet. I was like their puppy. My brother Joe was in high school and I was like 3. He would take me on dates with him to basketball games. And because I was like the mascot, everybody would come and gather around. All the girls liked it. And,
right.
And so I thought he was my boyfriend.
So tell me a little bit about, because we're obviously the one of the subjects, or the main subject of the show, is talking about the food that we grew up with. Mm-hmm. So was mom the primary cook at home?
Oh yeah, my dad could fry eggs. He could make polenta. He could make a few other things. My dad,
very exotic.
My dad's parents came from Italy. My dad was the son of Italian immigrants.
So that's the Mattea.
Yeah, and my grandfather worked in the mines at Cannleton, and there was a big contingent of Italian immigrants there who spoke Italian in the mines, and so that's where pepperoni rolls came from.
Yep. Which is the kind of ubiquitous West Virginia kind of signature dish now.
Yes, exactly.
Pepperoni rolls, but it came from the Italians. And for our listeners, Kathy's recollecting a history of the state during which mines were king. And mining jobs were good jobs. They were great jobs. But there were a lot of immigrant segments in the population that worked in the mines, including Italians, Poles, a lot of Polish citizens who came to this country. And so continue.
Well, so my dad, he loved spaghetti, and my mom had a really good, I never found out if she got it from my mom married twice. Her first husband died. Both her husbands were first generation Italian American.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if she got her spaghetti sauce recipe from the Capolanti side of the family or from the Mattea side of the family, but she made legendary spaghetti sauce and passed the recipe to me. I'm the only one in my family who can make it.
Kathy, I ask every guest for a recipe, so this may be on the block.
Okay, except that it's very hard to write down because I learned at the stove from her. Yes. And she measures her spices like, big pile, little pile, yes. Less of the rosemary than the oregano, and then more basil than it's like it's very hard to pass on.
I understand. I had a conversation with my good friend Joe Goodwin, who's a federal judge there, and it sits in Charleston. He and I went to graduate school or college together at WVU. Another degree of separation.
Go Mountaineers.
Yeah. And Joe talked about a woman who helped them out at their house who was illiterate, who literally would just grab handfuls of flour to make this legendary bread recipe.
Yeah.
And just throw,
Oh, I had an aunt like that who she couldn't read. My mom would call her and tell her what was on TV every night. And I never thought, it seemed odd, but I never really questioned it. And I found out later that she was dyslexic and she couldn't read and she didn't make it through the 8th grade. But I am telling you, there was wisdom in her about everything from, homemade remedies to like she made this apple pie that was legend. She would make one for me every time I'd come home from Nashville. And it would be black with cinnamon on the inside. And she would shred the apples on a grater. And I tried it, but they just turned to mush when I made it. And it took me years to realize it's because the apples came from the tree in her backyard. And they were hard as rocks and super tart.
Right.
And they were perfect for that kind of pie. And that there was a lot about because she just lived really close to the land on a farm.
Mm-hmm. Was she on the Italian side or your side?
She was on my mom's side. She was in Putnam County, yeah. In Polka.
Oh, wow. So
Polka High School, home of the dots. The polka dots. It's for your listeners. A little entertainment
that's right,
value.
Right. Yeah. A little local color. So what was a typical evening like around the dinner table? You had these two strapping older brothers, your dad, your mom, and you. What were the meals like, aside from the legendary spaghetti sauce?
It was like meat and potatoes mostly.
Yeah.
And we would we had this tiny kitchen, and we had a dining room, but we would eat in the kitchen, all 5 of us, and there was a glass kitchen table that was wrought iron, and we had 4 chairs, and my mother would go to the bathroom and get the bathroom stool and put it, and you couldn't get through. She would be backed up next to the silverware drawer.
Yeah, we had a kitchen like that.
And the 5 of us would eat there. And it was like, well, I was a grown woman before I had what a real steak was. Like, she would put the steak in the broiler on the bottom part of the oven, and she put garlic salt on it. But it was like freaking leather. It was like, I didn't know. I was like, I just don't like steak. I just don't like steak. I said to someone recently, we were out at on a trip with the band this weekend, and I was like, I did not know what a leaf of spinach looked like till I was out of the house, gone and out of the house. All our spinach came from a can. Well, and you put vinegar on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she would usually open a can of something and then make some kind of potatoes or some kind of starch and then a meat and make a salad. She made this great salad too. That's also legendary in our family. And I'm also the only one who can make it. Mm-hmm. She made it with iceberg lettuce and tomatoes out of the garden and onions, sometimes out of the garden. That's all that was in it. And I make it, of course, with salad green mix and, I changed it up a little bit, and I use olive oil. She used vegetable oil. But one time before I was born, she was out of salad dressing. And so she just made it on the salad with oil and vinegar. And it was such a hit that people kept asking her to do it. So you take the olive oil and she showed me how to do it. Again, there's no measurements, but you put it over the greens, and then, you'd first salt it with garlic salt.
Right.
Then you'd put the olive oil on. Then she would take the vinegar bottle and put her finger over it so it would sprinkle.
Right.
I don't do it that way, but you put more olive oil than vinegar, and then you toss it and you adjust, and there's just nothing like it. Like, all my friends are like, are you going to do the salad? You're going to do the salad because you're going to do that thing. And just little things like that.
Interesting how watching, I was the same. My dad owned a restaurant, which is one of the reasons why this show is about what it's about. Because I started out in my dad's restaurant working when I was 9 years old. The folks who are listening probably have heard this over and over again, but I was there a lot. And then I worked there from the time I was 9 or 10 until I was 18 and went away to college. But at home, it was all Greek. All the food was basically Greek food because that's what my dad wanted when he was off from the restaurant. And I watched my mom. Basically, she led us along. And this is a pattern that is not unusual, even in the highest echelons of cooking. I just did a podcast with Jacques Pepin.
Oh, wow.
Who's an extraordinary man. And Jacques talks about, he apprenticed in a restaurant when he was 13. And there was never in any of the great French restaurants that he worked in, including the Plaza Athénée in Paris and La Pavillon in New York, never any recipes. You had to watch. Wow. You had to watch the chef. You had to trail the chef until you knew exactly what to do. And yet, and as you are expressing now, and which is really interesting to me, when you talk about your mom's spaghetti recipe as well as her salad dressing, that cooking is feel.
Yeah.
Cooking is and it's also its transformation based on what you have available.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
But it was amazing to me that when Jacques said, no recipes. And he's basically not a recipe guy. So anyway, let's get back to your dinner table.
It's like jazz.
Exactly.
And music.
Exactly. It's improv, but with the instrument tuned, you're playing the specific
you learn
instrument.
The language. You learn the language and then you improvise.
Yeah, exactly. So dinner table, what was the conversation like around the dinner table?
Oh, I was the kid sister. So, I got left out a lot. I'm big personalities in our house. Big personalities. Oh, really? All of them. My dad was this big Italian personality. And my brothers both have big personalities. I'm an extrovert and big personality. My mom is kind of shy. She'd be kind of, I tell you one thing I do remember that blows my mind these days. Because you couldn't maneuver through the house or through the kitchen. There was, my mom would make a pitcher of iced tea for all of us for dinner. Mm-hmm. When my brothers wanted a refill, they'd just hold their glass up and shake it, and the ice would make noise, and my mom would pour them another glass.
Right.
Ooh,
The call.
I mean, I think how rude. And then I think, well, it's because mom was sitting by the tea. She was the only one who could reach it.
Yes.
And so that part was really interesting. I remember the other thing that comes to mind. One of my mom's staples was buttered potatoes. And she would take potatoes and peel them and then cube them, put a little bit of, they were basically steamed. And then she'd put pats of butter on them and some dried parsley. And that was like that, she had to fill everybody up. The other big thing that also I just remembered is my brothers, they were teenage boys. They could eat so much food.
Yep.
And, my parents were Depression kids. So everything was thrifty. And so I would go, my aunt lived in town up in the city in Charleston, and we would go visit her whenever there was a dental appointment or something, you had to go. So we would stop by Aunt Daisy's house. And on the way home, if you came over this was before the interstate went in, but we would come over.
Oh yeah, I remember
Little Tyler Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And right before you got on the windy part of the road, there was a day-old bread store, the Sunbeam Day-Old Bread Store.
Sunbeam bread, thank you.
If we were there on Friday, she would buy 3 loaves of day-old bread, and it would be gone by Monday. And she would buy the bologna in the big, and you'd slice it. Then you'd pull the red outside thing off, and there'd be a little bologna on it, and you pull it through your teeth to get the bologna.
Yeah.
Okay.
You just brought one back for me. I remember that.
Okay. Here's another question. We did, and I think this is a West Virginia thing, but it's not all over West Virginia. We had barbecued bologna sandwiches.
Oh yeah.
So you cook them in barbecue sauce in a skillet.
Or we would just take a slice of bologna and then you cut half of it into half of it, because otherwise, if you put it on
get the heat hump, man.
Yeah,
it doesn't
work. Right. Yeah. In fact, one of my bologna memories is that at one point I was opening the restaurant when I was in high school in the summertime. I would go up early in the morning and meet my uncle Xenophon. Oh. The whole family's Greek, obviously. And my uncle, who lived upstairs of the restaurant, he would come down in his strap T-shirt and a hairnet, and a pair of trousers and his slippers. And he and I there was a counter in the restaurant, and we would lay out 40 pieces of bread, white bread, slap a piece of bologna on each one, slap a slice of American cheese on each one, squirt some mustard on each one, then slap another piece of bread on, wrap the sandwiches up for the state road crew, who came in at 6 a.m. This was at 5 a.m. He and I were doing this. And then at 6, the state road came in. Their lunches were all right, bagged and ready to go. We fed them breakfast, and they were off. That's the overabundance of bologna story from me. But yeah, I remember that well.
Well, golly. You know what comes to mind about that, listening to your story, is there is a kind of relationship that develops when you are standing at that counter with your uncle. Like,
oh yeah,
you have open-ended time, you have a mundane task in front of you. It's not taking up mental space. And so your conversation goes to places that it wouldn't normally go, because you get distracted or something else is going on. Those connections.
Yes, true. Although my uncle's English was very fractured, and he didn't communicate very well, but still, there was a sort of symbiosis.
Yeah.
And
it's a little dance. There's a little kitchen dance.
Oh, absolutely. So back to I'm going to return to the table again.
Sure.
So the conversation was lively around the table with your brothers, your dad, even if your mother wasn't a contributor?
Oh, yeah. It was lively. It was pretty loud. And then this phenomenon happened. My parents got a little tiny TV.
Oh.
And it went in the middle of the kitchen table, partly because when we ate was right around when the news was on and the Vietnam War was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all wanting to know what happened. So that changed a lot of stuff.
Were there political conversations?
I remember my brother, the youngest of my 2 brothers, is a soft-hearted guy, very tender-hearted, sensitive. And I remember my dad just looking across the table and saying, if you get drafted, I'm paying for you to go to Canada.
Wow.
And actually, interestingly,
that's extraordinary, especially there.
That brother was at WVU when his draft number got pulled, and he was number 1 in the draft. Yeah. And he didn't go. It's a long story, and it's not about food. We don't have to talk about it. But it was quite that was very, very, we had 2 boys in our household that were going to be affected by it. So my other brother had done ROTC, so he wasn't eligible, so that was okay. But it was very compelling at the time.
Wow. And other than the conversations that were engendered by the television being there, were there any other sort of leitmotifs, things that sort of happened a lot at the table that?
Not that I recall. Okay. I think I do remember in the summertime, my brother's friends would come in and we'd all have lunch together. We'd eat bologna sandwiches together. And I was the kid sister and I was right at the table with them. And my dad worked across the hill in Nitro, and he would sometimes bring a friend home, and he was my Uncle Red. And I'd get to have, Mom would make soup for him. She would make this Lipton soup. It was this mix, and it had little tiny noodles in it.
Yeah. I remember that soup.
And she'd make that and some kind of sandwich. Maybe it was either cheese sandwiches or bologna sandwiches. And I'd have to sit next to Uncle Red. And so I remember a lot of lunches around our dining room table. But the extended family is where the real cooking came in. I mean, my aunts and my cousins, and there were lots of big gatherings with lots of.
What was that like?
Oh my God, it was the best. We had, from the time before I was born, my mother and father hosted the family Christmas Eve party. So it was the best day of the whole year. Like, Mom would spend days getting ready, and the ham would go in the oven early in the day, and it would fill up the house. And then like at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, people would start arriving. And my dad, there was no place to park the cars. So he'd park the cars in the backyard. We had a carport. He'd drive them straight through. And at the end of the night, he'd drive them down the hill and back down to the road. It was like everything got thrown out of the window. And it was because the ground was frozen and he could park them in the yard. And so it was, and everyone you love most in the world came. Everyone, we had tons of cousins. First, we have pictures of like the first cousins. Then they grow up the second cousins, the third cousins.
Now, is this on both sides?
No, just that was my mom's side.
Just your mom's side.
And like there were traditions like my Aunt Daisy would make baked beans and my Aunt Teeny would make baked beans. And Aunt Teeny was the one on the farm. So hers came from white beans that got cooked, and then the barbecue sauce got made, and then they baked them after that. And only the beans never quite cooked all the way through. They were a little crunchy. But Aunt Daisy's, they were really, really good.
Right.
But you had to take some of Aunt Teeny's and
yes,
Aunt
right.
Daisy's,
Yeah.
So you had to like take one for the team.
Right. You don't. Yes. Right. You don't want a weeping aunt.
Exactly.
Wandering around. Nobody eats my beans.
My cousin Shirley would make macaroni salad. I mean, everybody had their thing that they made, and she would make macaroni salad, and it was the only time I ever ate macaroni salad. It was like potato salad, but macaroni. And I don't know. It was just like it was something really special about it. The other big memory, and sometimes we would have these in the winter because they'd be frozen, was half runner green beans. Did you eat half runners? Do you know about half runners?
No. What are half runners? I'm a gardener, so I'm interested. What?
My aunt who lived on the farm had this huge garden, and we had a garden in our backyard, but for a few years we wanted a bigger one, and they were 10 minutes down the road. So we planted one down there, and we would go and help, pick things and hang out. And she planted rows and rows and rows of these green beans, and they're called half runners. They only grow in West Virginia. Like the soil has to be a certain kind of chemistry.
Alkalinity or whatever. Yep.
But they are like, you can cook them to death and they don't get mushy.
This is a string bean, a long string bean?
It's a string bean. Yep. They pop. They're not flat. They're small and round, but they have a lot of flavor. And she would make bacon in the mornings and save the grease in the can on the stove, right? You had it said grease on the front of it, and you pulled off the lid and it had a little sieve in it. And you'd pour it through and the hot grease would go through and then all the other bits would get sifted out.
I can't tell you how many people I've talked to in this podcast who had the can of bacon grease by the stove.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, when you made the green beans.
Doesn't happen anymore. Yep.
When you made the green beans, you put them in the pot and you took 3 or 4 big scoops of the bacon fat.
Bacon grease. Yep.
And then you would just cook the dog out of them. Like you'd start them with water, like, halfway up the thing. And then you'd cook them till there was like half an inch of water in the bottom. My mother, when I went away to college and then on to Nashville, whenever I come home in the summer, she'd go to the vegetable stand at the edge of the town in Nitro and she'd buy 4 pounds of half mothers. And I would have them eaten by the end of the weekend between me and the family. It was like, and when they're fresh off the vine.
Oh, yeah. There's nothing like fresh vegetables right off the vine or off the plant.
Oh, I have to tell you, when I went away to college, I realized it was like food went from color to black and white. Because in the summer, we'd go pick some corn, as you've probably done many times, pick the tomatoes. We had the onions. We had the garlic. We had, and the whole meal would have been alive a little while earlier.
Half an hour before. Yep.
And so you realize that a tomato off the vine is a very different experience.
Totally different.
And my mom would can tomatoes in the summer. Did your mom do that?
No, my mom wasn't a canner, and we didn't, in Beckley, we didn't have a garden. My dad had a couple of little tomato plants.
Yeah.
Just enough to sustain us through the summer.
Always.
But there was not a garden per se. He just had a little plot that he put together.
Well, my mom would do tomato canning and the kitchen would just be so hot in there. And then she would, she'd sterilize the jars and she'd boil the tomatoes. She'd skin them. She'd dip them in boiling water and skin them.
Yep. Just
and then cut them in quarters and cook them. And then you would can those and we would be sitting in the living room watching TV and you'd hear, she'd, 2 more of my cans. And she'd go in and check them because they had to, as they cooled, that was how she knew they sealed.
Mm-hmm.
And
the vacuum would occur inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the secret to her spaghetti sauce was the canned summer tomatoes.
Fresh canned summer tomatoes. I grow a lot of San Marzanos. San Marzano tomatoes, sauce tomatoes. And I freeze them. And what I do is I will put them in the oven on a very low heat for like half an hour just to get rid of some of the moisture. Put a little olive oil on them. Sometimes I'll throw some fresh garlic and some basil in there with them. And then straight out of the oven, I throw them in a freezer bag and stick them in the freezer, and I have them all winter.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I used to have some tomato plants and I froze them too. And I was like, I don't even care. I'm not canning these things, but I want them in the middle of the winter. And I would just whir them up and chop up the skins with them,
Yeah, always. I do the same thing. And by the way, canning itself is very labor intensive.
Yes.
And very hot work.
Not
especially
pleasant.
not in the middle of the summer. I just as soon, stick them in the oven, chop them up, stick them in the oven, let them dry a little bit, and then freeze them. But were there other things from the garden that you remember other than the beans and the tomatoes? Any greens?
Early lettuce in the spring.
Right.
Leaf lettuce in the spring, but only in the spring.
Right.
My dad, they had a big garden, and he talked about them growing celery. So there's a thing my dad and I used to do. No one else in my family liked it, but he called it acampucky. Acampucky is my dad's word for any gooey thing.
Right. It's a very onomatopoeic word. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so
acampucky. I got to remember that one.
Acampucky. And my grandfather brought this over from Italy. And it's not uncommon. It's a sort of peasant food. You take a bowl and you put olive oil in it. And then you put vinegar in it. And you put some salt in it. And you take celery, green pepper, green onions, tomatoes, and radishes. You had to have radishes. And you'd cut the radishes up into little discs in the bowl. And then you'd cut up a tomato in pieces in the bowl. And he would take the celery and he'd put it on the edge of the table and he'd smack it with his fist so it would get little cracks in it. And you'd dip that in the bowl, take a bite, and then you'd take a fork and you'd eat some tomato and some radish. Then you'd have a bite of bread.
Ooh.
And you'd take a green onion, and then you'd take some of the green pepper, and you just kept alternating.
Was this a sort of tangential Italian tradition, or something that he created?
It was something that I think my grandfather had it when he was a kid.
Oh.
But again, just like your uncle, my grandfather didn't speak very good English. And so I never could have an in-depth conversation with him. But
right.
This was my dad's passion. My brothers didn't like it. My mother didn't like it. So it became a bonding thing with me and my dad. And even now, in the middle of the summer, when I can get some really good beefsteak tomatoes or something really juicy and ripe, I sit down at my kitchen table alone and I have Akampucky in honor of my dad. I have a meal with my dad.
This is so much what this show is about, which is remembering things either auditorily or olfactorily or just from, whatever connections our synapses make in terms of growing up. And suddenly something comes to you and it brings back not just the food, but also the person and the time and the relationship.
Yeah, it was a special thing between us, and we were the only ones in the family who liked it, but I felt just the same way he did about it. And the thing to just make sure you get the whole picture.
Yeah.
What happens is the tomato juice mixes with the olive oil and it's cider vinegar.
Oh, yeah.
And the salt, you salt the tomatoes and the radishes in the thing. So you get the texture and you get the juice from the tomatoes becomes part of the mix. And then the more tomatoes you eat in it, the more like complex and interesting it gets.
Yeah.
And so it becomes, and it's so like, you have to do it, right? You can't just eat it. You have to do it. You have to wash all those vegetables, and then you have to like dry them off. And then you have to figure out how, and the texture of the crunchy celery, and then you
got to beat that celery.
Oh, it's great. Yeah. And the best part that we would like divvy up was when you got to the very heart of the celery, that tiny little heart that was just tender, and the leaves, like sometimes he would just give that to me. He just
eat the leaves as well. Yeah.
Oh my God. The leaves are the best part.
Centerpiece. Yeah, exactly. And so, by the way, celery is a brilliantly nutritional food.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Very nutritional in a lot of ways.
What he told me was when they grew it, when it would grow out of the ground, they would wrap it in paper to keep it from getting too green, to keep it kind of white. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
I've never had any luck growing celery, so I'm envious.
Yeah, it's one of those. I know it's something you buy in a store, and who knows what it looks like when it comes out of the
ground. Right. I've had the same experience to a certain extent with carrots. My carrots sometimes are great, and sometimes my carrots are not great. It just
interesting.
Depends. Yeah, and also when you think about it, the people who grow these things know exactly what the soil composition should be. And so they grow these beautiful, shapely, organic.
My dad would go every spring to somebody's farm that he knew and get buckets of manure.
Oh, yeah.
Cow manure. And this was like gold. The car smelled like hell. But but this was like the only thing he would use. It was his thing.
Yeah.
And he had, he would mix it into the
soil. The best fertilizer
like a mad
of the world.
Scientist out there. Yeah.
Yeah. I compost.
Yeah. Oh, that's
everything
good.
From the kitchen that's left over goes into the compost pile and gets mixed in, and then it gets mixed into the soil. It makes a big difference. Also, it speaks to one of the big problems that we're having in first world countries, and that is food waste.
Yeah.
There's so much that we throw away that ends up in landfill that is either edible or compostable. But I won't get on my preachy platform about that. We'll move along. So then at home there was a real kind of wonderful sort of mixture of Italian, all American food, garden some fresh garden stuff. So then you did have greens in the summertime.
We had greens in the summertime. We had iceberg lettuce most of the rest of the time.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure I really liked that leafy lettuce stuff. When I was a kid, I liked the crunchy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I was used to. Took me a while to appreciate the nuances of food. We also made a lot of stuff, as many people in West Virginia do. Cream of mushroom soup was quite a staple in our house.
Yep.
We made those church recipe book, those little bound ones that we sell at church bazaars. We had several of those. There was one that was very popular called Mountain Measures. And I think my mom had 3 copies of it. I still have one here somewhere because it's a tradition to have one in our house.
Any very uniquely West Virginia dishes that you recall? Because I was trying to think today before we talked of things that I could think of, and I couldn't. I mean, I could think of scrapple.
Yeah, scrapple. We didn't eat scrapple.
This was much more of a sort of lower economic household where people would take whatever was left over and sort of grind it all together and turn it into a burger or a loaf of some kind. I've had a couple of people on the show who talk about having scrapple when they were kids. Two
of my dad's really favorite things from being really poor was polenta.
Oh.
Which I, as a kid, never really liked, but he would nurse it on the stove and he would cook it and mom would make it. And she put a thing, some kind of metal thing between, we had a, coiled electric stove, but she would put this little metal thing underneath it, which would mitigate the heat and keep it from sticking to the bottom of the pan. And then we'd have it and he would get me to have some and I'd be like, nah, I don't like that. And then he would put it in a loaf pan and put it in the fridge and then slice slices of it and fry it with eggs the next morning.
Oh, the best. Oh, yeah.
The other thing I remember one of my dad's favorite snacks, he would take saltine crackers and break them up in the bottom of a bowl and put milk on them and then put sugar on it and eat them. And I looked at him one day, I was like, Dad, what? He was like, oh, honey, we couldn't afford cereal when we were kids.
Yeah.
So for him, it was a nostalgia thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, here it is. Something that brings back a time. And that's important.
Yeah, it is.
Because it also brings back his community, where he grew up, his parents. Even though it was a time of privation, it was also a time, I'm sure, in many instances of great joy and celebration. Oh, yeah, exactly. So then, did you guys ever go out?
No.
Just didn't.
I think I remember something was going on and I went to Shoney's with the neighbors and my friend Jennifer.
You're the second person I've talked to about Shoney's.
I think that's the first meal out that I can remember having. And I can remember feeling a little scolded because I had the straw in the bottom of the glass and I was sucking it and making noise. And her dad, he said, I thought you were going to put on your best manners tonight. And I'm like, I was like, oh, I'm not home. I can't, straw was exotic.
Yeah.
It was very, we didn't really, we'd go to fast food or something like that, but we didn't spend money on that. My parents were really, really thrifty because they'd grown up so poor.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, when I remember growing up in and being with my aunts and uncles, and they would do things like cook greens, and when they would finish with the greens, they'd put them in the bowl and put olive oil and vinegar or olive oil and lemon on them, which is the sort of Greek tradition, and then take the pot and drink what was in the pot.
Oh.
They called it, my aunt Lula used to call it pot liquor.
Pot liquor, yeah, of course. It's like and you spell it Likker.
That's right.
As I've seen it spelled, but it's also supposed to be like Liquor. It's the liquor from the.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing wasted.
Yeah.
And when you.
My mother used to say, "Did your mom do this?" She would when she would save the wrappers from the sticks of butter.
Oh.
She would use those to butter if she was making a cake or something.
Yes. My mother was a proponent of Heloise.
Oh, yeah. It's
Remember
from Heloise.
Yep. So she would have, little hints, and she'd always pass them on, even when I was away, long gone.
Yeah.
I would get, I'd get a letter from my mom, and in it would be a recipe or a suggestion from Heloise as to how to shortcuts in the kitchen.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so then you're now, let's say you're getting older and you're in public school. What were the public school lunches like?
Oh,
horrible.
Atrocious. That's another thing. It's pretty funny to me that I probably go through a bag of fresh kale every week at my house now.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like when we had kale as the vegetable at lunch, it was much like the spinach I grew up with. It was inedible.
Overcooked.
I also remember sometimes, I think they had like a food pyramid thing they had to go by. And so there had to be so much protein and so much. And I remember them putting cheese sticks on the tray, but they were cheddar cheese. They were like Longhorn or something. And I had only had American cheese growing up. My dad loved blue cheese and, all kinds of Italian cheeses, but those were all too strong for me. So it took a long time for me to adjust to real food. It was interesting that school lunches were, I was pretty much, I just liked food, I wasn't, and I didn't get much of an education. So I pretty much would eat it if it wasn't the kale or the cheese sticks or something nasty. But I remember a lot of macaroni and cheese and,
Oh, yeah.
that sort of thing.
What about when you went away to college? Any food awakenings? Things that you were just not in your family's wheelhouse that you were exposed to in college?
Well, there was the dorm food, which was sort of, there was always, we called it mystery meat. And so there was that. That was sort of institutionalized. It was where I had my first pepperoni roll.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the canteen lunch was right around the corner from my dorm. We would go down there and get burgers. It was mostly burgers and stuff.
Yeah.
It was a place downtown called the Dining Room, which is like, was like a cafeteria, but they served you, it was like basic food. And we'd go down there and have meatloaf or something. So I remember there was a little restaurant that's still there called Ruby's and Catchy's out by Cheat Lake. I don't know if you were ever there.
I remember Cheat Lake, of course. Yeah. See, I was WVU 60 to 64.
Okay.
So some of these places,
it was like it had been there forever. It was in an old house, and they
probably
made fried
was there.
chicken. That's the other thing. My mother made great fried chicken. That was her other big specialty. She would make, but Ruby's and Catchy's had great fried chicken. These were the kinds of meals. It was just, it was regular person food. It wasn't really till I got to Nashville that I started thinking about food. And when I got here, I was young. I was 19, and
so you left school to go to Nashville.
After 2 years.
To pursue a music career.
I came to spend a year to find out what would happen.
Right.
Because I didn't want to be my age, 63, wondering what would have happened if I'd gone.
Yeah.
And because I skipped a grade in school, I skipped the first grade. I woke up one day and realized, one of the guys in the band I was in college was moving to be a songwriter. And he said, you can come with me if you want. You don't have to worry. You just come on.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, one day I woke up and I thought, I've got a year to play with. I'm a year younger than everyone in my class. So I could go to Nashville. And if it doesn't work out, I could come back and go to school. And maybe if I answer the question, I'll have more peace going through the rest of my life. I won't be wondering what would have happened. Which
is an extraordinary revelation to have when you're 19 years old.
I don't know.
Sounds like you were a very mature teenager.
It's interesting because now I have the chance I do a little lecture thing for the kids from Berklee College of Music every year. And I tell them that I'm like, do you want to know? Do you want to know the truth more than you want to not hurt? If you can stand the no, the information will help propel you forward.
Yep.
And I was willing to get the yes or the no in order to get the monkey off my back, basically.
And what was the monkey?
Music, like what if? Because it wasn't really a question until my friend was moving. And when my friend was moving, I was like, oh, I would never go alone. Nashville was way too big.
Mm-hmm.
But going with somebody, I knew that I wouldn't make it alone. I couldn't emotionally handle it. But so he was going and he was graduating, and I was a sophomore at the end of my sophomore year.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, if he goes to Nashville and he gets famous and he's living this great life and I am stuck up here in school, I'm never going to forgive myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I just,
now, obviously you had been musical when you were younger.
Yes, always. It was the thing that kept me sane. Basically,
piano.
Took piano lessons. I was a border collie. My mother was trying to keep me occupied. So piano lessons at 6. I got my first guitar at 10. And I tell people that music saved my life. I was emotionally kind of immature for my age and intellectually way ahead.
Right.
So this made a really tough gap. And it made me, the kids don't want to be friends with you when you know the answers to all the questions,
right?
Way before they do. And they're not quite as excited about that as you are.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went away to Girl Scout camp in Greenbrier County when I was 10, and I had a revelation, which was that if you had a guitar, you didn't have to fit in. You could play the songs and everybody would gather around. And not only would you have community, but you were the facilitator of the community. It was like magic.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me a way to hang with my peers until I really learned how to relate to them.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was obviously a period of some privation when you got to Nashville. Things didn't happen right away.
No, I got a job as a tour guide at the Hall of Fame. Then I started losing my voice, so I found a little job as a secretary. I started taking voice lessons. My friend moved away after 10 months. He's a dentist in Richmond. And I stayed. I made a bargain with myself that I would invest. After he left, I would invest another year of my time, and I would eat, breathe, and sleep music. And after that, I started to get enough feedback that I had something that it was worth staying. So, that's the short version.
How long is if you can sort of précis that time period? How many years did it take before you were in a position where you had a career?
My first single came out 5 years to the day from the day I moved to Nashville.
Wow.
I didn't have a hit for another couple of years, but that was the timeline for me.
It's interesting because I talk to a lot of young people as well as you do when you talk about your lectures that you give. And one of the things I say to young people who are interested in theater or in films, most of them are interested in becoming famous, is that if you have the sense that if you have the long term in mind of having a career in whatever it is you want to do, that fame is really ephemeral anyway, regardless. If we're lucky enough to have 5, 10, 15 years, 20 years of work in what we'd like to do, we're among the blessed few. The Screen Actors Guild has something I think 90,000, 100,000 members, 10% of which are working at one time.
Yeah. Wild, isn't it?
I have a friend, Michael Patrick King, who's one of the creators of Sex and the City and who did a podcast. He was in New York he arrived when he was in his early 20s, and he got his first writing gig when he was 38.
Wow.
And in that time, he worked in restaurants, he loaded baggage at Greyhound bus, he did improv on the side. And the one thing that kept him sane was that whenever he had a restaurant job, he would quit after 3 months because he said, if I stay here, I won't make it.
I'll get so comfortable.
Yep.
I'll get so comfortable. Well, and that's the fire in the belly. And there's also something that's intangible. I don't know if you felt this, Chris, but it's like it was something in me that had a vision about it that was almost like with me from when I was born. Like it felt like there was a path there that I was just trying to find.
Yep.
And it's hard to put that into words. It wasn't like destiny and it wasn't like guaranteed in any way, but it just felt like what I'm supposed to do here in the world. It's like, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. And it manifested itself. It happened.
It did. And that's part of what I talk to the kids about. It's like, you have to listen to that voice inside. And that means turning off the social media and the screens. I mean, it's quiet in there and you have to learn to tune into it like a radio station if you're going to find the next right thing.
Yes, exactly. And interestingly, I don't know about you, but one of the seminal moments for me was at WVU. I had a couple of professors who were, there's one guy, I don't know if he was still there when you were there, a guy by the name of Patrick Gaynor, who taught a very, very obscure poetry class, English class called 101 Scottish and Irish Ballads of all things. And it was a book by a British, or a Scotsman, a Brit, who had synthesized all of the old ballads of the Scottish and Irish ballads and traced their lineage, their etymology of where they came from. This song came from a Norse ballad, which came through such and such and so and so. And then you looked on the page and there was a song called The Gypsy Davy, which is an old folk song, right? And this guy would go up in the hollers, Patrick Gaynor, with a big old Wallensack tape recorder, which probably weighed like 40 pounds.
Yeah.
And he would put it down and he would just listen to people sing. And they would be singing the songs from that book. The songs that were 1,000 years old.
Yeah.
Now, I know that this is something you've experienced in your folk music days and in your roots music, Americana, your interest in it, obviously. It was such a thrilling discovery to know that this was part of who I was. That I came from, even though I grew up a Greek, my parents spoke Greek at home, I had a hard time fitting in when I was growing up because I was a stranger in a strange land, and I was always trying to, I don't want my parents to speak Greek in public. I constantly move away from them when they would speak Greek in public, to my everlasting shame.
Yeah.
And this was such a, wow. I'm not a hillbilly. I'm a part of this extraordinary chain, human chain, oral chain.
Yeah.
Isn't isn't this something that is just so amazing?
Oh, it's primal. The reason it gets passed down is that it makes a primal connection. And for me, like I'm telling you, I feel exactly what you're talking about. And for me, I mean, I discovered a lot of that stuff when I made a record called Coal, all about this.
I know. Yep.
I've pieced together family stories when I made that record and like into a larger narrative. I began to, it was like a quilt, little pieces coming together in a bigger story. But really for me, what the thing about music or any great piece of art is that it stirs something in you that you can't control.
Yep.
And that's beyond all the surface connections. And for me, with music, the thing that I love about it is it's participatory. So my joke is, I got into music because I sat around the campfire with a guitar and I suddenly felt part of something. And now I have like songs that live in everybody's head and I get them singing. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, and so my whole thing is like, I'll look up and say, thank you for daring to let your neighbor hear your voice and just deciding you're not going to care. And here's the other piece. When you're sitting next to someone you don't know and you're both singing the same song, you have no idea who each other voted for.
That's right.
You don't know anything about each other. You're just enjoying this moment together.
That's right.
It transcends all that stuff.
You were this past week in heavy rotation in my car. And one of the things that struck me, aside from the fact that first of all, what an extraordinary vocal artist you have always been.
Thank you.
And also that the expression of your taste is very clear in the choices you make, the song choices you make, and the arrangements. And also, the other thing that struck me, because I grew up singing in choirs.
Mm-hmm.
I sang a lot in church choir. I sang in choral union at WVU, where there was an amazing professor. There's another one, a guy by the name of Joe Goltz, who was the conductor of the choral union. And we did the Brahms Requiem, we did the Carmina Burana. And to stand there with 400 people and sing, not only sing together, but sing in harmony. And that was the other thing that I was really struck by as I was listening to your records. And that is that there's something about our tuning to each other that is sacred.
Yes, I agree. I say every night in my show, or a lot of times, I'll just say, singing is the most ordinary thing in the world and the most sacred at the same time. And that's part of what's magic about it. Bobby McFerrin, I did a workshop with the great Bobby McFerrin one time. And he had us do an exercise where for 1 minute, you'd set a timer and you'd be in twos and you had to talk to each other and you had to tell a story, but both people talked at the same time. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the minute, you had to say what your friend's story was.
So you had to listen and...
You had to talk, you had to create and listen, and you could feel your story change by what you were hearing. And you had, so what that does is it tunes you into another person in a way that we don't usually take. It's a nebulous skill, but I think that's also part of what music does. It's like we hear another person and we're not the only thing and we're resonating together. And it's the same as conversation, but the energy is the same. And it's just an easy way to get to it. It's just such an easy way to access that through the back door kind of.
Yes, right. The back door of the soul.
Yeah.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this, and if you don't feel comfortable getting into it too much, it's okay. But you talk in some of the research that I've done about this dark place you went to when your voice was changing, and it's something that as we grow older, I remember. I think I remember the day when I lost my vibrato, or at least what I thought I did.
Yeah.
And so can you talk to that a little bit about what that journey was like and how you've used it in a way to create something new?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very rich subject for me, and I love to talk about it. And people don't ask about it, in any nuanced way very often. But yeah, I think it was menopause really, that really changed the way. And what I've heard since is that for some people, the vocal cords just move ever so slightly further apart. Well, if you're an alto, your vocal cords are vibrating slowly anyway. So any greater distance is going to make that harder to do. So all of a sudden I would go for notes that I knew how to hit these notes and they wouldn't come out. And for a while I kind of muscled through and I was like, oh, I'll be better tomorrow night. I'll be better tomorrow night. And then I just woke up one day and I realized I was going to have to turn towards this. Well, my focus, my decision about what I was going to do came from a random conversation I had with Tony Bennett one time. And it was the only time I ever met him. I was just in this random gathering with him, and he was shy and off in the corner, and I was too. And I thought, you've got Tony Bennett all to yourself. What do you want to ask him?
Right.
So I looked at him. I said, can I ask you a question? He said, sure. I said, I heard you sing tonight, and I know how old you are.
Yeah, because he was singing into his 90s.
I heard him sing when he was 90, but he was probably in his late 70s.
Even then.
He's like 78.
Yeah.
And I said, how did you do it? And he just took a second and he looked down at the floor and he kind of smiled and he said, well, my voice isn't what it once was, but it's a lot better than it was a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I found a teacher and I started working on it again.
Hmm.
And so when I felt the same thing happen for me, I took my inspiration from him. In fact, when he came to Nashville and he was 90, I sent a note backstage. And I didn't expect to hear back, but just in case someone reads this and can tell you, you changed the course of my life. I think I might have stopped singing if I hadn't had that one conversation with you.
Wow.
And so I found a teacher. I had a teacher for many years, but she was getting older and we had become friends. And so, a voice lesson would turn into a visiting session
Right.
and, we couldn't really do it anymore. So I found this person who works with Bobby McFerrin and we did Skype lessons. I found her at the workshop. She was on his faculty and we hit it off, and she's a jazz singer. And my longtime teacher was an opera singer.
Mm.
So there's a bit of a different approach. And I practiced and practiced. Sometimes I would practice for like 3 hours a day. Just stop practicing 3 hours a day. You're trying to fix yourself. And I wrestled with it for a couple of years, probably 2 to 3 years.
And were you performing all this time?
Yeah, I was. I was resisting lower in the keys on any of my stuff, even though, and what happens is, and you'll understand this, and I don't know if your listeners will or not, but there is, for a woman especially, there are 2 different registers, and there's a little transition between your chest voice and your head voice. That was what I had learned to make very smooth over the years, only it moves. I got older and it moved down. So the note that I knew I had to make the transition on that I'd been doing for 30 some years suddenly was different. It was all different. I had to relearn how to sing.
Mm-hmm.
But I still had all of this struggle and all of this grief because I couldn't sing the same songs in the same keys, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to lower the keys, and I felt like that was cheating, and I was going to get this thing. And then a friend of mine who does all kinds of workshops came to Nashville to do a grief workshop. And I didn't have anything particular that I was grieving.
Oh, wow.
But I love this woman. And I was like, well, I'm going to your workshop because you're from California and you never come here. So I signed up.
Yeah.
And I went with a friend who had just had a big loss of death in her family. And we were in a small group. And she led us through this exercise where you had to pick something that you were grieving and you had to go all the way into it. And I had just watched the Ken Burns documentary on PBS. They had rerun it. And I had happened to catch the segment with me in it.
The country music.
The country
PBS,
music
right.
documentary.
Yep.
And it was me when I was really young, singing at the peak of my powers.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched it and I was so overcome. And I had just seen it like 2 days before, and I just went into it and I was just like, I want that voice. I want to be that girl again. And I just went all the way into the grief of the impossibility of that. And out of that moment, like getting to go all the way into it, this thought came to me. And I was like, well, I don't have that voice anymore. But I've got the closest thing to that voice on this planet. And maybe that's enough.
And you've also got a life that imbues your songs with much more richness.
Yes, but if I can't make the notes, it doesn't matter. And that was where I was finding the rub. And so I came out of it. It's interesting. I came out of it. I was like, oh my God, that's it. Wait a minute. I don't want to throw that away because I'm not her, but I am her. Just like this face is not her face, but it's still her face.
Yeah,
and
right.
I thought, if I can just look into the essence of it and look to embrace what is alive in me now that has the same, maybe not exactly the same, but the same vibe. And I called my guys and we were on the Opry the next week. And I said, I'm taking Where Have You Been down a half step and maybe a whole step. So you guys be ready to play it in any key. And we took it down a whole step. I've done it a whole step down ever since. And the song came to life. It's where it lives today. And you know what? No one realized, no one in my audience cares.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is some of my songs are in the same keys and some are in different keys. And it just depends on how they sing. And I finally I surrendered to all of it. And it started to come to life again. And it was like death and resurrection. It was like the resurrection of it all.
And you just expressed a phrase that was really quite wonderful. You said it's where it lives today.
Yes. I could not let go of the past long enough. I was trying to find my way back to the past. And my teacher, God bless her, she really helped me. She helped sustain me through that. And now she just came to a show I did she lives in Minneapolis, and she was just like, we have to Zoom. We have got to have a Zoom session because I saw the work you've done. I saw it. I hadn't had a lesson with her in a while, and it was just a beautiful thing to see her see me,
Oh, how great. How great.
Yeah. And well, and I've lived my whole life doing this, and it feels like my work in the world. And so to find my way back into it in a way that I can keep going just feels like the biggest gift.
Well, on that note, Kathy Mattea, I must say this has been such an extraordinarily enjoyable and revelatory conversation. I thank you for coming on Cooking by Heart. I can't tell you how much fun I've had just sort of reminiscing about growing up in our beautiful home state.
Yeah.
And I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
And don't forget Kathy Mattea's newest album, Pretty Bird. It's wonderful.